it's Megan Ramos here with another episode of the Fasting Method podcast. Today, my co-host, Dr. Nadia Pataguana, and I have a special guest. His name is Dr. Stephen Hussey, and if you don't know about his work, you definitely need to learn it. I followed Stephen online for quite some time, and he was kind enough to send me some of the other works that he's done previously. And well, with COVID and moving to California, everything's gone a little bit nutty. But in the Fasting Method community, once a month, we interview a guest who's outside of the community, myself and Coach Larry on our team. And Larry does a great job reaching out and coordinating experts that are in line with what we talk about and that are often talking about things that are hot topics within our community too. So, people are talking about different dietary trends, different cardiovascular trends or concerns. He'll always try to get those experts lined up. So very recently, Larry connected with Stephen, and I thought this was great. I remember his work from before moving during a pandemic and my life being turned upside down. And I think he's great, and let's have him on. And we were just chatting before recording, and Nadia said, I shot her a message, and Nadia, what did I say?
You want me to read it? I'm going to read it because I was pretty impressed, seeing as I didn't know Stephen as well as you guys did. So September 16th, Megan shoots me a message. This is kind of how we do our podcast, how we choose our people. Hey, Nadia, Larry and I just interviewed Stephen Hussey in the community, and he was probably our best guest ever. So that pretty much got me. Although I got to say, this is a pretty big one. You'll see some of these questions. Thanks to Larry, because Larry definitely thinks outside the box and his brain just is on another level. So a lot of this, it's huge. I think a lot of the community will appreciate this. And if you're anything like me, you're going to be doing a lot of learning today.
Yeah, I knew right away we couldn't keep this information exclusive to our community members. We had to get Stephen and his messaging out there. So we've talked a lot about him, but I'd like to formally welcome Dr. Stephen Hussey to our program. How are you doing today, Stephen?
I'm doing well, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So for our community who might be new to your work, do you want to tell us a little bit about what it is that you do and how you got started on this journey?
Yeah, for sure. So, I guess day to day, I'm a chiropractor and a functional medicine practitioner. I run a very neuromusculoskeletal type practice in Virginia. But my passions, not just chiropractic, but is also kind of in heart health. And that's been, that was, I guess, stemmed from my own personal health journey. So as a child, I had a lot of inflammatory conditions. When I was a kid, I had asthma, I had terrible allergies, I had IBS. I used to break out in hives like the size of my chest, and the doctors could never really tell me why. I just had all this inflammation. Ultimately ended up with autoimmune type 1 diabetes, where my body attacked the cells that make insulin. So I no longer make insulin, which is different than type 2 diabetes, where you're still making insulin, but you're resistant to it. You're not responding to it. In my case, we tend to see it in younger people, but now it's happening in older people too. My body attacked those cells. I no longer make insulin, so I have to give myself insulin. So I learned pretty early on after that happened, because my parents and I were kind of thrown into the world of Western medicine and reliant on them to help manage these conditions that I had. That type 1 diabetes heavily predisposed me to heart disease because of the damage that can happen to the small arteries, the capillaries and things. And so I've spent a long time now trying to figure out how to protect myself from heart disease and learn as much as I can about it. And in that journey, I figured out that the way I lived my life had a direct impact on my ability to manage type 1 diabetes and the other inflammatory conditions I had, which I found funny that no doctor really told me that as I was, going to endocrinologists and other doctors. But yeah, I'm happy to say that all those conditions are gone now, aside from the type 1 diabetes. It's kind of that collateral damage that comes from that inflammation, or for me at least. And so, I've just kind of dove headfirst into the heart and just had no filter whatsoever, like any information on the heart. I didn't care where it came from. I wanted to read about it. At one point I looked up and I had all this information, a lot of it quite contrary to what we've been taught about the heart and what causes heart disease. And I started sharing it on social media and people seemed to like it. And then I eventually wrote a book about it. And that book came out in April. So here I am, helping, spread this information that I think is really, really important.
I think it's so important. Thank you so much for doing so. I think one of the reasons why we're so aligned, or two very big reasons, is everyone on the TFM team. And I think that's why, Larry was so drawn to having you two as a guest. We have had to walk the walk through our own health experiences. We've had to devour all of the information that, sort of pertained to us. And then we came together to help share and collaborate that information. Like I struggled with type 2 diabetes, Nadia with PCOS, and our journeys, it really, we had to become complete and total students because the information out there is just so baffling. Another thing is, like, you practice this. You are doing this with people. You're not just sitting in a lab, and you're just, not sitting at a desk in a library writing or researching. And all of that stuff's really important. But there's also that clinical aspect of it where you really see the science applied and what works and what doesn't work. So I think that's kind of, where our strengths are, is having that clinical experience, because that's what tells the true story. Anyways, I'll start rambling. I know Nadia's got a question for you.
Well, I actually got just a couple of points here. Once I learned a little bit about your story, I can totally see why Coach Larry of our team was so interested in speaking with you, because he's got this big theme. And I think it's a theme that runs throughout our program, but he often mentions the wounded healers. This is like a common theme that we all have here. Megan mentioned her own background, my own personal health concerns, and then being able to bring this to the people that you work with, your patients, your clients. There's a special kind of passion that comes with being a wounded healer, as Larry would call it, somebody who's living through certain conditions. And we're touching upon some of the big ones here, right? Heart disease, all these other inflammatory concerns, and of course then diabetes and insulin. So that's big. So, I'm just a little bit in awe right now, because there's just a lot. But Megan, you go ahead and ask Stephen our first question.
Yeah. Stephen, in your recent book, you discuss oxidative stress and reactive oxygen species in response to the foods that we eat. And you talk about mitochondria being conveyor belts. Can you tell us more about the importance of these terms, oxidative stress, oxygen species, mitochondria, and why our mitochondria might become so overwhelmed with modern snacking?
Yeah. So, everybody hears about mitochondria, like, the powerhouse of the cell. They're what make our ATP. And ATP is like our little energy currency for the body. It's what, fuels all the little processes that happen in the body. But that's not what mitochondria do, or not the only thing mitochondria do. They also make water, and this water is in a structured state, which is very important. They also give off heat, which is very important because it's infrared heat that the mitochondria give off, which is really important for kind of a biophysics or a quantum side of the body. But they also have quote unquote waste products. And that is, a free radical or an oxidative species, reactive oxygen species. And these are just species that they want to have a paired electron and they don't. And so they will do anything to get that paired electron. This is just kind of a natural byproduct of making energy, just kind of like a car makes an exhaust. So we can call it the exhaust. But I call these things like the Looney Tunes Tasmanian Devil, where they're going around like crazy trying to find a paired, and they'll steal it from anywhere, including stealing it and damaging something else in a chain reaction sort of thing. But these things are thought of, or they're spoken of many times as being bad, but really they're there for a reason. They act as signaling molecules to the body to trigger satiation and things like that. However, if we get into a state where there's too many of them made, then that can create an issue, especially for the mitochondria that directly make them. It can come back and damage those mitochondria. It can also damage the cell. They can get out into the bloodstream and damage the lining of the artery, things like that. And so we want to do things that decrease the likelihood that we get an overwhelming amount of these oxidative species, these Tasmanian devils, right? And one way that situation happens where we get this overflow is if we have inefficient metabolism. Right. So if we're burning a fuel source that makes too little energy and we have to keep burning more of it, we're going to make more reactive oxygen species in the end. And so that, to me, that fuel source is glucose. If we're entirely dependent on a glucose-based metabolism, we're burning through lots of carbohydrate, which is why, people who eat lots of carbohydrates, especially processed carbohydrates, like in the morning, are hungry 2 hours later because you burn through it really fast. You make a lot of oxidative stress, and studies have shown that, especially in muscle, that burning lots of glucose, primarily glucose, results in more oxidative stress, more of these free radicals produced. And so when we look at a more efficient energy source where we can burn that fuel source and get more energy, more ATP, and less oxidative stress, that is fatty acids and ketones. those are incredibly efficient fuel sources. And so, I've looked a lot into the heart, and that's especially true in the heart, where the heart prefers to burn fatty acids and ketones, especially ketones, in an organ that's constantly contracting, that is always using a high amount of energy. One of the mitochondrial dense tissues in the body, it prefers fatty acids and ketones because that's what keeps it efficient, and it keeps it from damaging itself or creating these oxygen species that damage itself. So, hope that makes sense.
It does, and it makes a good case for intermittent fasting, which falls in line with everything that we're talking about here.
It totally makes sense to me as well. And of course, that ties it in, of course, what you do and what we do, and probably why Larry and Megan were so excited to have you here today, and why our audience, you're just bringing in a new element. So we've talked a lot about your work and a lot about your book, but I don't think that you've told us what it's called. And I think the name of your book, and I think that our listeners would love to know. And then if you could please summarize, based on that, what's in your book, the diet heart hypothesis, and why the conventional view, and this is a big topic again, of LDL, right, the quote unquote bad cholesterol, and the lipid panel interpretation doesn't actually reflect what you've discovered.
Yeah, so my book is called Understanding the Heart, Surprising Insights into the Evolutionary Origins of Heart Disease and Why It Matters. I talk about a lot of different things in the book, as far as I take it way back to pretty much the origins of multicellular life, and some of the things that we see form during that time that are still present in us today that are important to know as far as the imbalances that happen today that lead to heart disease. So I talk about that. I talk about what humans ate through evolutionary history of humans, which is about, modern humans, about 300,000 years, but even before that. And I talk about, like you said, like this diet heart hypothesis. How did we get from these humans that were literally made into what they are today by a diet high in animal fat and animal foods to today, the conventional wisdom thinking being that high cholesterol causes heart disease and saturated fat causes heart disease? Like, how did we get there? And it goes back to, the 1950s. So before the 1950s, like even in the early 1900s, the field of cardiology was not even really there. There was a few medical doctors and researchers that were, interested in the heart. And so they were looking at that. But this whole, all these cardiology associations and this field of cardiology wasn't that big of a thing. It wasn't until the 1940s, like after World War II, late 40s and then 50s, when heart disease began to rise, people were wanting an explanation. People were scared about it. People were having heart attacks. President Eisenhower had a heart attack very famously in the White House. And so people were worried about it. And the idea that came out of that from some poor quality science by a guy named Ansel Keys was that higher amounts of saturated fat and cholesterol in our diets and high levels of cholesterol in the blood were what caused this. And, by the time that theory was tested in the late 50s and 60s, the theory had kind of taken off. There was a lot of money behind the theory with the sugar industry and the grain industry. And so that theory kind of took off. And then when they actually did test it, well, first of all, it was based on research that it was the lowest quality research there was. It's epidemiology or associational research, which can only show that something is happening at the same time as something else. It can't show that one's causing the other. And unfortunately, most of our nutritional recommendations from government agencies and academic institutions is based on this type of research. Ansel Keys also did some stuff where he kind of cherry picked the data, and he only used the countries with the data that gave him the association he wanted in his first couple studies. And so he kind of cherry picked the data. But yeah, by the time that was tested, which they did some heavy testing on this theory, and they started doing studies where they replaced saturated fat with unsaturated fat in the diet. And they found that the more unsaturated fat people ate, that the more heart disease they had, the more cancer they had, the more all-cause mortality they had. But those studies were kind of hushed up and swept under the rug and published in small journals and things like that, because this theory that had a lot of money behind it, it was making a lot of people a lot of money, had already taken off. It was on the cover of Time magazine, the little frowny face with the bacon or whatever. And so, yeah, but when we look at it from a physiologic standpoint, it makes no sense that this one molecule, LDL, which carries cholesterol on the body, would be the cause of heart disease, that this one thing in the blood, because, our bodies are very complex biological ecosystems. And, it's very short-sighted to say, okay, there's this one thing, when it gets high, it causes this whole full-blown disease process. It's way more complex than that. And when we look at cholesterol in general, it does a lot of very, very good things in the body. It's used for the making of our hormones, the making of vitamin D. It allows cells to communicate with each other. It does so many different things, muscle function. So when we start aggressively lowering that, we see that the systematic review studies show that it doesn't prevent heart disease, or it's not preventing heart disease, that being our main treatment. But also, we get a lot of side effects because you're preventing the body from making cholesterol and having that cholesterol available. So whether it's sexual dysfunction or muscle pain or cognitive issues or whatever it is, those drugs, they tend to cause those things because the body really needs cholesterol. And then, like I said, in aggressively treating high cholesterol, we're not getting the result that we want because it was never the cause in the first place.
Yeah, it's actually the people with the lowest cholesterol levels that are at the higher risk for mortality from cardiovascular complications. So it's just so wild. And I really appreciate you addressing this because cardiovascular disease is not the main focus of the fasting method. We tend to work with more type 2 diabetics, PCOS, fatty liver conditions with our members. But we're asked this nonstop because they do not know how to engage with their doctors about this because it's like everybody's on repeat. And I experienced this myself. I'm 38, but on my 30th birthday, my annual checkup with my doctor, she's my whole family's doctor. So she had been my doctor since I was about 4 years old. So she was really well versed with our family's health history. Well, so was I. So I made these radical changes in my mid-20s to my lifestyle and was just thriving health-wise. And I had really functional medicine standards, optimal cholesterol levels. I wasn't at the bottom of the barrel where my mortality risks would be great, but I knew the foods, everything. I was functioning optimally. And when I went in to see her, she's like, okay, we're going to put you on 5 milligrams of Crestor. And I said, whoa, hold up there. Why? And she said, well, this is just this is the new practice. This is the new standard of care. And I said, but my labs are phenomenal. My A1C is 4.7. Everything is fantastic across the board. My lipids are not too low, but they're still, even within traditional medical standards within range. And she said, but your family history, you have a family history. You're now 30 years old. People are developing cardiovascular disease earlier and earlier and earlier on. And let's take a look back at our diets, right? So I'll always use this as an example when it comes to type 2 diabetes. My grandmother had type 2 diabetes. She didn't get diagnosed till her late 70s. My father, her son, had type 2 diabetes. He got diagnosed in his 40s. His daughter, me, developed type 2 diabetes in her 20s, her late 20s. So sure, okay, there's a genetic disposition to having issues with diabetes, type 2 diabetes in my family. But why did my grandmother get twice as many years as my father? Why did my father get nearly twice as many years as me before developing this condition? And prior to my grandmother, nobody had type 2 diabetes, right? So you talk to your doctors, genetics, this and that. But really think about it. Our dietary changes, Ansel Keys, it came in and did his villainizing of fats and, cherry picked his data as you shared in the late 70s. Well, that's when my grandmother's diet changed. That's when my father's diet changed. And then I was born in 84. So I just grew up eating garbage all of the time. And now we're seeing kids under the age of 10, type 2 diabetes, gastric bypass surgery, heart attacks, cardiovascular events, like diseases that were thought to be for the elderly, then the middle age, and now it's becoming the norm for younger kids. So we really appreciate you sharing all of this information with us. In your book, you went on quite a self-nutritional discovery when working in Ireland. Can you describe what to you is a heart-healthy diet and why from that experience?
Yeah. So I think, from everything that I found and what I've kind of, concluded is that it's any diet really that creates metabolic health. And so that can be lots of different types of diets that can do that. There are some diets that I think are better than others as far as doing that, along with providing you with adequate nutrition. Because, there's lots of talk today about vegan diets, and you can eat a vegan diet that creates metabolic health. That's very possible. However, I think that long-term you'll be deficient in things. But there's a lot of dogma today about different diets, and it's got to be this, it's got to be that, it's got to be, all animal foods or paleo, or it's got to be vegan or whatever. And in reality, it's not about following this certain dogma and making sure you're eating that way or something, and then making everybody else feel bad for not eating that way. Lots of people do, but it's about, is the diet you're eating working for you? Is it achieving your metabolic health? Is it getting you your nutrient requirements? Then that's the most important thing. If that is a carnivore diet for you now, that's great. If it's not later, that's also great, because your dietary needs and what diet works for you is going to change over time. Just like it's going to change for other people, so it's not about sitting here saying, oh, everyone has to eat this type of diet because humans are this or humans are that or anything like that. But I think the most important thing, I guess, things that I found for like pretty much all diets are eat whole foods. So stay away from processed foods, stay away from processed things that have been processed all the way down to their individual constituents. Like that's when we seem to have a problem, is when we take all the nutrient wisdom out of food and we process it down to things. So that's, even for some people, I would say like, because people have like MCT oil and things like that. It's like, well, that's a processed food and you may be able to use it for a certain benefit, but it's still a very processed food, and overdoing it could be problematic. Just like vegetable oils are just a very processed food. It's one nutrient, it's unsaturated fat, and there's very little else in it. And those are the foods that give us a problem. And so when I think about this, it's one of the examples that I think we need to step back and have a little humility for the wisdom of nature, right? And what was available to us in nature, so I could never make a vegetable oil if I was living in nature. I need complex machinery and all these different things. I could never make processed flour. I could never do any of that stuff without the modern day stuff that we have. And so stepping back and say, hey, nature got it right, or God, or whatever you want to call it, got it right. And we need to eat the most whole foods possible, as close as we can, because there's lots of foods available today that we would consider whole foods that maybe weren't available back then. But, it's like, it's not being dogmatic. It's eating whole foods. It's making sure that the diet you're doing is working for you, and being wise enough to realize that when it's not working for you, you need to change rather than sticking to that dogma.
Wow, I am absolutely loving this. I can totally see why Megan and Larry love talking with you. Everything that you've said about diet, I think, fits so nicely with our message, our approach within our community. Very much diet inclusive, but a very big focus on whole foods. Switching topics slightly, but a big topic for me. Funny that this is something that Larry and Megan enjoy talking with you about so much. It is one of my 5 pillars. So just even though we talk so much about diet and fasting in our program, this is a big one, stress management. Can you describe why stress management, healthy stress, and heart rate variability is so important to you personally in our overall heart health?
Definitely. This is the thing that I think I want to draw the most attention to, because in health circles, everybody talks about, diet, exercise, that type of stuff. And those things tend to dominate the conversation. And we say, oh yeah, and manage your stress. And it's kind of this thing that's tagged on to the end of everything. I think that when people say things like stress kills, like they may think they're joking or whatever, but they shouldn't be, because it does. Our body handles stress through this thing called the autonomic nervous system, which is just a system in our body that's consciously, measuring our environment through our senses and telling your body if you're in a safe or threatening environment. And based on which one you're in, it has the appropriate response. So if you're in a threatening environment, it tries to get away from that or run away from it or fight it off or whatever. And different systems in the body are activated to do that. But if you're in a safe environment, then your body says, okay, well, we can do things like eat and digest or sleep or procreate or detox or whatever. We can do those things effectively. Unfortunately, humans are the only species on the planet that I know of that can think their way into a stress response. We can literally see something happening halfway across the world on the news to someone else and think or fear that it's going to happen to us and think our way into that stress response. Or we can see something happened to a loved one a long time ago, and we can fear that it happened to us, or that it'll happen again, or something, stressful could happen to us that day. And instead of having the normal physiological response where we address the stress, get rid of it, and then go back to baseline, we stress about it the rest of the day. That's because of our big brains, which has gotten us amazing places as a species. However, it also makes it hard to handle the constant unnatural stresses of the modern day, which are plentiful. So many different things that are not necessarily life-threatening things, but we tend to have life-threatening responses to them, or at least our physiology does. Like if you live in a city and you hear all the traffic and the noise and the horns and the sirens and everything like that all day long, like your brain is smart enough to say, okay, those things aren't life-threatening to me in this instance, but your body hears those unnatural noises and is having a life-threatening response. You may not feel it, but it is. And that's creating this imbalance in the autonomic nervous system where we don't get stuck in one state or the other. People think, oh, I'm in sympathetic or I'm in parasympathetic, but really they're always happening at the same time. And they're supposed to balance each other. And so when the balance gets off and we're having more stress signaling than we're supposed to, we can call that decreased vagal tone or an imbalanced stress response. And that is incredibly important for a lot of different things. It has been shown to cause inflammation and oxidative stress when we have these stress responses we can't tone down. It's been shown to cause insulin resistance. And it's been shown to, cause heart attacks or be the number one trigger for heart attacks. It's definitely been shown to cause different clotting mechanisms that happen. So when we look at what atherosclerosis is, it's not this buildup of cholesterol and LDL, it's clotting. And so we're encouraging the body to clot when we're in this stress state. And so this imbalance in the autonomic nervous system is a really, really big deal that I feel like not too many people are talking about, because I think, unfortunately, the main reason they're not talking about it is because it's hard to make money from telling people how to balance the autonomic nervous system. There's things you can do, but it's hard to be very, very super profitable when you do that. So, and we live in a capitalist society, and that's just the nature of things. But, helping balance the autonomic nervous system, especially to the heart, because the heart, it's really in tune with our emotional state, with our stress state. It's why we say things like, I love you with all my heart, instead of I love you with all my liver or something like that. Or we say we gave it all our heart, right? There's this emotional connection. It's also a heavy emotional connection to the gut. That's why we have gut feelings about things. These are not mistakes that we say things like this, that our language pervades this. But the nervous system signaling to the heart especially needs to be balanced, because if it gets imbalanced, that can force a shift in metabolism that can cause heart tissue damage, which I talk all about in my book, and I outline the mechanisms by what that happens. But it can also cause, irregular heartbeats, like arrhythmias and things like that, because the nervous system is not communicating well to the heart. And so it's really important that we balance this. And it's no mistake that the way that we measure this is through heart rate variability. So the way that we measure this balance in our emotional state, this balance in our stress response, is done directly through the heart. So the best measure of balance in this is heart rate variability, which is basically just the difference between time interval difference between heartbeats. And it's supposed to be generally wider. We should have a ability to have a bigger heart rate variability. And I like to describe heart rate variability better using something called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, because I think it's a better illustration, but it measures the same thing. It's just a different number. And so if people took their pulse on their wrist or whatever, and they took a deep breath in, and like a slow, deep breath, they'd feel their pulse quicken. It would get faster. And then they took a slow breath out, they would feel it get slower. And the difference between the fastest it gets when you breathe in and the slowest you get when you breathe out is the respiratory sinus arrhythmia. This is measuring balance in the autonomic nervous system. So how ready or how able are you to go from a stress and a non-stress state? Because when you breathe in, you're creating a little bit of a stress state. When you breathe out, you're creating a little bit of a non-stress state, which is really, really important to have balance in that, especially for the heart. The way we create balance in that is doing things that people may consider woo-woo or whatever, especially people really versed in Western medicine. But it's like having positive social relationships, which sounds like it would, it's just like, yeah, that's good. But it's like, no, it's actually really good for us. And having those toxic relationships create this imbalance, but also exposure to nature, being in the sun, putting your feet on the earth, that kind of thing. And then there's the things like meditation or prayer or things like that. Like infrared sauna use has been shown to balance the autonomic nervous system. Just chewing your food properly has been shown to do it. So there's just so many things that stimulate the vagus nerve, create this balance. That can go on and on with it, but it's living a life that's, I guess, away from or divorces itself from most modern human life, which has become so inundated with the wrong type of light, the wrong type of stresses, a go mentality. It's not doing favors for our autonomic nervous system and the stress response that we're supposed to be balancing.
Wow, I feel like you were just describing me there. It's like, me. And you're right. I mean, just going back to your original point there, even when I talk about stress, and I do every single day, when I mention it in my 5 pillars, it's always the 5th pillar. I always put it at the end. Maybe I need to switch that around. It needs to come to the front. So thank you for that reminder.
Lots of really great lifestyle practices there that it's really important to control stress. Something that's been glamorized a lot is busyness too. And it's just, I used to think I needed to be busy in order to be successful until, I was in the hospital with a blood pressure of 73/43 after losing the ability to stand just from chronic busyness and the stress that it has on your body. And I've realized, no, being successful is, treating your body the way it needs to be, taking care of your body, your systems, mind, body, spirit, all of that stuff, and finding a balance. I might work less now on paper, but when I do, I'm so much more productive, and it makes a huge difference. And I'll share some of the stuff that I do for me on social media. People say, how do you have time for that? Well, you can mix and match things. I'll do meditation or breathing while I'm doing red light, or do dry brushing, and there's all different ways to combine all of this stuff. But if I don't take that time every day, then it all just kind of goes downhill. And I saw this meme a few years ago on social media, and it said, stress undoes all of your good efforts with diet and fasting, and it's just so true. So we mentioned so many great things that people can implement, but one of the questions that Nadia and I, our whole team, are asked the most are, which tests should we be advocating for from our healthcare practitioners to make sure that we're keeping an eye on important cardiovascular markers and metabolic health markers?
Yeah, I get this question a lot too, because people go and they want to assess their cardiovascular risk, and their doctor's okay, we'll just take a lipid panel, and that they think that's the end all be all. Sometimes they'll take an inflammatory marker or something like that, like HSCRP. They'll actually get that one. But yeah, so in my book, I talk about the three imbalances that I think drive heart disease and pretty much all disease, which are poor metabolic health, high inflammation / oxidative stress, and then imbalance in the autonomic nervous system with the heart rate variability and things like that. So along those lines, the best things I think that we should be looking at for as far as mitigating risk or assessing risk, or for metabolic health, I think that a trig to HDL ratio. So if we get that lipid panel, that's great. We just want to look at the triglycerides divided by the HDL, and that number should be, in my opinion, 1.5 or lower. That's a good indicator of good metabolic risk, but also make sure that you're fasting long enough before you take that test, because they say, 8 to 10 hours is good, but really I want you at least like 12 to 14 hours fasting to get an accurate triglyceride number. So there's that. And then the other, I think, most important one for metabolic health is a fasting insulin level, because that can detect whether someone is insulin resistant way before they become diabetic. So even if someone has normal blood sugars, normal A1C, the fasting insulin's high, it means you're having to use more insulin to keep those numbers that way, which means suggest insulin resistance. So you can detect it then before it becomes anything harder to correct. But yeah, fasting insulin level. So as far as like inflammation and oxidative stress, I mean, you can really get into the weeds testing these numbers on things. You can test a lot of different things, but I think that ultimately the best test for inflammation, I think, is the high sensitivity C-reactive protein, just for like general inflammation, you get kind of an idea of what someone's state of inflammation is. And then I like taking a GGT number, which is a liver enzyme, for looking at oxidative stress, like how much is the liver having to deal with. But in reality, like, I wouldn't get too far, because you can test so many things, different things, like damage to fats or damage to DNA. You can, from oxidative stress and stuff, you can test all that stuff, but the way you treat those things and the way you get rid of that stuff is the same whether the test is high or not. So you might as well, instead of just spending all this money testing, spend your money on changing your diet and getting things that you need to help you combat that stuff. Even if it was not elevated, just do those things to keep it not elevated, And then as far as imbalance in the autonomic nervous system, heart rate variability, which you talked about, it's always good to be tracking. And so when they say with heart rate variability, anywhere from 20 to 100 is like normal. So it's important not to compare your number to somebody else. You get your baseline. So you have to measure it for a week or 2 weeks, something like that, and kind of get to know what your baseline heart rate variability is, and then work to improve it from there. But don't say, there's a 60 and mine's only 30, or anything like that. You just want to try and improve it from wherever your baseline is. And then, people talk about scores like the calcium score, the coronary artery calcium score, or the carotid intima score. And these are just assessments of, how much long-term calcified plaque there is in arteries. And those can be good scores. I'll just say that, like with the CAC score, like it's just measuring the calcified plaques, not measuring the soft plaque. It's quote unquote more dangerous and things like that. But it is a good number. It does seem to be predictive of whether or not someone's going to have a heart attack or heart disease in the future. But also realize that, because I've had a lot of people say, I'm going to make all these different changes to my lifestyle and diet and things like that. And then they go get a CAC score and then it's like 600 and they're like, what? but it's like, how do you know it wasn't 800 and you did all these things and now it's 600, so it's really hard to tell which direction you're going with just one benchmark. You kind of need multiple ones along the way. I just get that. I find myself explaining that to clients a lot. So I thought I'd mention that there, but those are some things that I think that are good to kind of assess your risk and kind of keep tracking. But I also think that it's important to understand that testing is just one snapshot in time and usually just one tissue in the body. I think that it's really short-sighted to think that we could assess someone's total health by just blood work or just this one test or just one tissue in the body, because there's so many different things. And I think that, again, it comes from like this, our human brains thinking that we can control something or get a total understanding of something in this complex biological ecosystem that is the body. And so just kind of take that with a grain of salt, that I don't think testing can ever tell you if you're unhealthy. Generally, it can tell you if there's something really wrong, like in an emergent situation, like, oh, this number is not good right now. But I don't think it'll ever tell you if you're healthy or not. Because I get so many people that come to me and say, well, my blood work looks fine, but I feel terrible, right? Or this testing looks totally terrible and I feel fine. So it's just like, what are the standards? And it's really important for people to know that, with cholesterol, like when we first decided it was bad, which was a decision, there was no observation that it was bad. It was just a decision that they made that it was bad. They said, okay, well, LDL should be 250. And then they lowered it to 200 and then 150 and then 100. So it's like, that tells me they really have no idea what cholesterol is supposed to be. And just focusing narrowly on that doesn't really make sense, or focusing on any one test doesn't really make sense. We have to look at it in conjunction with someone's really their entire life in their state of how they're feeling now with the testing and everything.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So, Stephen, before we wrap up here, tell everybody where they can find all of your great work. We're going to link everything for everyone, including Stephen's new book that came out this year, in the show notes. But Stephen, where can they learn more?
My website is resourceyourhealth.com, and I do my online coaching there. My books are there. My blog is there, and things like that. And then my book is on Amazon. People can order it from the publisher. They can get it from Barnes & Noble. They can get it most places books are sold. And it is audiobook and ebook as well. And then I'm on social media, just Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, Dr. Stephen Hussey. People can find me there, reach out if they want, or on my website.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us again to a different part of our Fasting Method community. We're really so inspired by your work, and just thank you for doing everything you're doing and spreading the word and just collaborating with us yet again on getting the message out there.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great meeting you.
All right, everyone, we'll see you back here next week. Happy fasting for now.
Bye, everyone.